Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the Asylum interview orientation session that we have specifically geared for attorneys and accredited representatives. It's hosted by Vicina, along with being done in collaboration with the Welcome Legal Alliance. Just to let you all know, today's session will be recorded and it will be provided that recording in a few days on a link that we'll share in the chat throughout the session. But let me first start by introducing myself. I am Chelsea Mack. I am the mentoring attorney for Afghan projects with Vicina. And then I'm also going to be presenting today with Jenny Guilfoyle, who is the legal director with Vicina. And so we are just so grateful for you all attending and just being interested in supporting the Afghan community in this way. This interview session is specifically geared for Afghan asylum interviews. However, a lot of the tips that we're going to provide are definitely applicable to interviews for other populations. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, we just want to make sure that you all know that Vicina is not the government. We do not work with USCIS. We're a non-governmental organization, nonprofit organization, and part of our mission is to help mentor attorneys with various legal processes, and the affirmative asylum process for Afghans is definitely part of that. So the session we have been holding in the past for Afghan applicants specifically, but we thought it would be also important to provide one to help guide some of those attorneys out there who may be seeking some assistance with their cases. So today's interview, we're going to be discussing the purpose and the nature of the interview and the logistics of getting to the interview and the office. We're also going to be going over who needs to attend the interview, what things you need to bring, especially as the attorney, and what your role is during the interview. And then also providing tips on how to best prepare your client for the interview. And then at the end, we will be able to answer any questions that you all have. So we just ask that you put those questions into the Q&A, and then we will be answering them hopefully throughout, typing answers, and then be able to answer them live at the end. So with that, we will get started. I'll let Jenny start.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, and thanks so much, everyone, for being here. It's great to see all of you, as Chelsea said, interested in supporting Afghan asylum seekers with their asylum interviews. So if we could actually go on to the next slide, Chelsea, if you don't mind. We're going to start out talking about the overall purpose of the asylum interview. And the asylum interview is a required and crucial part of the affirmative asylum process. And it is a chance for USCIS's asylum office to interview the asylum seeker to figure out if they meet the US legal requirements for asylum. And it is required of every applicant for asylum that they attend an interview at the USCIS asylum office. And we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about what the asylum office is and who asylum officers are. For your client, this is really their chance to tell their story to the asylum officer and to explain why they're afraid to return home and what would happen to them and what's already happened. And it is a crucial part of the way asylum officers make decisions in asylum cases. They want to hear very much from the applicant themselves about why they're afraid to return, so that they can understand what the person's afraid of, what's already happened to them, the person's afraid is going to happen in the future. The asylum interview is also an important part of the asylum officer assessing the applicant's credibility. And the credibility, the truthfulness of the asylum applicant is a crucial part of every asylum case. And the officer is going to be assessing carefully what the applicant says in that interview and comparing it to what's in their written application, comparing it to known country conditions to try to make a decision about whether or not this person's telling the truth. And we'll talk a bit more about that a little bit later in the training today. And the officer, again, will be assessing the person's legal eligibility for asylum. So what is the asylum office? And our next slide just talks about this a little bit. And I think this is a photo of the outside of the Chicago asylum office, if I'm not wrong. The Asylum Office is part of USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the branch of the Department of Homeland Security that is charged with adjudicating immigration benefits. And one of those benefits is asylum. So USCIS has a whole asylum division with asylum offices around the country. There are, I think, 12 main asylum offices in cities around the country, and then they have sub-offices. And they'll also do what they call circuit rides to cities where they don't have offices. The Asylum Office's entire mission is adjudicating affirmative asylum applications. That's really all they do. And it's staffed by asylum officers. Who are asylum officers? Well, it might be helpful to start by thinking about who they're not. Asylum officers are not judges. They are also not required to be attorneys. My guess is probably half of them are, because that's the kind of person who ends up kind of being interested in this work. But it's not a requirement of the job. And there are plenty of asylum officers who are not attorneys. They do get a lot of specialized training. They have to go to several months worth of training before they can start adjudicating cases. And they're required to have constant training from the asylum division, all about asylum law and asylum cases and how to adjudicate asylum cases. So an asylum officer, all they do all day long is review applications, interview applicants, and prepare decisions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea to talk about the logistics of the interview.
Just to give you just some perspective, so when it comes to the interview is going to be a pretty long process. Now, of course, the timing of the interview really varies. It could be anywhere from 1 hour. We have been hearing reports of interviews lasting only an hour or so, but it's definitely more common for it to be several hours. We usually range and even tell the teams that we're working with, just be prepared. It could be 1 to 6 or 7 hours. So with that stated, it's just best that you and the clients just even mentally prepare for that. So one of the things I know your clients are going to ask is, what should I wear to the interview? And we always just suggest that the client wear something that's comfortable, because they are going to be sitting there for quite some time and telling their story, and things may become a little bit more even emotionally and mentally taxing on them. But then also for them to dress in a way that shows respect to the asylum officer and whatever that may mean for your clients. Now, your client, you should instruct them to bring any original identification documents that they may have. So this may be the Tazkira, their passport, if they have their EAD. If they do happen to have any other original documents, such as birth certificates or marriage certificates, definitely encourage them to bring those. But if they do not, then just whatever identification they have on hand is definitely helpful. They should also plan to bring water, because again, this interview may take some time, and they're allowed to ask for breaks. So just encourage them to bring some water. Sometimes we even tell clients, if they are bringing young children with them as derivatives, they can even bring snacks for them to chew on while they're waiting for the interview to finish. So you as the attorney should definitely plan to bring a photo ID as well as your bar license card. The asylum officers like to ask for that. Also a G28. If you did not already provide a G28 with the initial filing, say if you're covering for someone or you are stepping into the interview after it was already filed, maybe pro se, definitely bring a copy of the G28, but I would just bring a copy of the G28 just to be safe. And then also a laptop or notepad, however you like to best take notes. It's important that you take notes throughout this. You really want to be able to have some documentation of the questions being asked, because if there are any later follow-ups about the interview, whether it's another interview or possible NOID or something like that, you want to be able to have documentation of and record of what happened, because the only note-taking that will be taking place during the interview is by the officer. There's no recordings of it. There's no audio of the interview. It's just the officer sitting there taking notes. So you want to have your own as the attorney. Also, we suggest that you bring a copy of the form I-589. as well as if you have the declaration and exhibit list, have all of that. Now, those of you who have been filing these online, all that information should be able to be provided immediately to the officer. But those who maybe have filed by paper, definitely bring a copy of the 589. I know I've had many experiences where I show up to an interview, especially for an office that maybe is not necessarily an established asylum office, but on the circuit route. And the officer just was not given the documents in time. So they really appreciated a copy of the 589. But having either the full copy, if this was a paper filing, have the full copy of everything that was submitted, bringing that, or at least having everything, including the exhibits, on your laptop, easily accessible throughout the interview in case the officer needs to access or ask questions about it, is helpful. Then also for you, we also suggest you bring water, even though you're not the one that's talking most of the time. It can be a very tense situation watching your client going through this. So we just suggest that you bring some water to refresh you. Now, getting to the asylum office, as Jenny mentioned, is usually a large office building. And so the asylum office itself may only be in a specific room or specific floor of that building. And so when you're a client and you arrive to the asylum office, you'll have to go through a metal detector similar to the airport. Have to go through a bag scan, so they'll have to, strip down any metals or shoes, taking those off if there's metal in them, any of that. And then once they go through that security check, they will need to show their interview notice to the asylum officer sitting at the window just to check in. And then the officer will take their fingerprints and their photo, and then they'll be sent to wait in the waiting room. Now, this part gets clients really anxious just because this could be a lot of waiting. For those of you who are not as familiar with the asylum interview process, or just USCIS and immigration in general, if this is your first case in immigration world, just know that it is very common for interviews to last to not only last a while, but also to start at a much more delayed time. So if your interview scheduled at 8 a.m. and they're not getting you until 8:15, 8:30, or even later, just be patient. Tell your clients to be patient. Make sure your clients know ahead of time that the length of their wait for the interview to begin has no indication on their case and the outcome of their case. It just may be that the officer is running late from a previous interview, or just something else may be coming up. And then once the asylum officer does call your client, they will be calling them by the last 3 digits of their A number. So just make sure you have that ready to walk in and start the interview. Now, it's also important for us to just review for you as the attorney who needs to come to this interview. So first, the principal applicant, who is the person who filed the application, the main person whose name is on that front page of the 589. They are the principal applicant. They must come because they are going to be the ones providing most of the testimony in support of the application. Now, if there are any derivatives for the case, whether it's a spouse or a child, any of those who are included on the Form I-589 also need to attend. Now, just to make sure we're clear, a spouse is someone who the person is legally married to, and then the children are any child who is unmarried and under the age of 21. Now, also, when we say included, it means that on pages 2 and 3, and any other addendums that you may be adding in when you're listing that spouse or child's information, and then there's the question that says, is this spouse or is this child, do they intend to be included on the application? They need to be marked yes. And again, this is just spouse and children who are in the United States. This is not the proper process to use if your client's spouse or child are overseas, still in Afghanistan or some other country. But all of the spouses, there should be one spouse, but all of the children and the spouse who are in the United States presently and included should attend this interview, regardless of age. They all need to be present.
We wanted to provide a quick update about interpreters for asylum interviews. So as of September 13th, 2023, USCIS has announced that all affirmative asylum applicants must bring their own interpreters to their interviews. This means that the interpreter must attend in person with the client at the asylum office. The interpreter cannot appear by phone or otherwise remotely. Also, this means that now USCIS is no longer going to provide any interpreters by phone. So in order for the interview to continue to go forward, the interpreter must have been brought by the client in person with them when they appeared in the asylum office. So who can be an interpreter? The person must be 18 years of age or older. They must also be fluent in Dari and Pashto and English, or if there's another language that best suits the client. And they need to make sure that the client and the interpreter understand each other. And also that the interpreter is interpreting exactly what is said word for word, and not giving summaries or giving their own input into the response or into the question. And make sure you let the client know that they should not wait until the end of the interview to let the officer know whether or not they understood the client, or if there were some hiccups in some of the translation or interpretation. So the interpreter is not allowed to be a family member who is a derivative on the case. So that means a spouse or a child on the application. They also cannot be someone who is a witness to the case. This means that they submitted maybe an affidavit in support of the asylum application. If you are the attorney or accredited representative, you're not allowed to be the interpreter. Also, interpreters are not allowed to be representatives or employees of the government, specifically in this case, the Afghan government. So the client's country of nationality, they're not allowed to be the one that they're claiming persecution from. Also, if someone has an asylum application that is pending, but it is not yet adjudicated, there's no decision, but the person did not attend their interview yet, they are not allowed to go and be an interpreter for someone else's application. So to put it another way, if someone who does have a pending asylum application still waiting on that approval, hopefully, but they already attended the interview, their own interview, maybe 3 months ago, they're allowed now to go and interpret for their friends' interviews. So that's a change in the policy that USCIS has provided and what they used to do before COVID. So it now really opens up, especially for Afghan clients, many other possibilities for interpreters to bring. And we still recommend, if your clients ask, we still recommend that they avoid using family members if at all possible. And this is really just to avoid any additional information being shared or just overview of details that weren't necessarily shared by the clients in their testimony. We don't want anything to be interpreted that is adding to the story of the client. We want the client to be able to tell their story in their own words, and the interpreter is just supposed to interpret word for word. So again, these are just some updates as of September 13th of 2023, and we hope that you share this information with your client.
How to work with the interpreter. Many folks are going to be and have been working with interpreters who are not trained professionals, which is absolutely fine. Someone does not have to be a trained professional. But if that's the case, absolutely, it's crucial to practice in advance with the interpreter. At the end of the day, the asylum officer is only going to hear what the interpreter says in English. Anything else is just lost in a black hole. Like, the asylum officer will never hear that. And so if someone's not a professional interpreter and the applicant has never worked with an interpreter, in pretty much 100% of cases, what will happen if you don't practice this in advance is that two things will happen. The applicant will be asked a question and will give a very long answer, and will talk and talk and talk and talk and pause after 3 minutes of talking. And then the interpreter will try to translate. And you can imagine the interpreter is a human being, not a robot. So they'll forget things or get things wrong or summarize or not be translating word for word. That will 100% happen. And the other thing is that will happen for sure if you don't practice in advance. is that the interpreter and the applicant will often end up having side conversations where the interpreter is trying to be helpful by like clarifying something with the applicant, and then they have a conversation back and forth. The asylum officer won't allow that. They're going to tell them not to do that. And again, it's really crucial that the interpreter just interpret exactly what the applicant is saying. The interpreter should understand that their role is really to be the applicant's voice in English and the asylum officer's voice in the applicant's language. So it's, again, really crucial to work in advance with the applicant and the interpreter to get them used to each other and to get them used to doing this. And it's actually, it feels awkward to speak 2 or 3 sentences and stop, but it's really crucial to do that. You really want to make sure that the officer hears everything that the applicant says as much word for word as is possible. So with that, then the understanding that it's really crucial for the officer to hear everything the interpreter says, I'm going to turn it back to Chelsea to talk about what questions the officer is going to ask and what happens during the interview itself.
So there are basically 3 kind of general areas or topics of questions that the officer will ask your client. So before they get into the form I-589, they're just going to ask who helped prepare this application. And this is mainly to see, first, does your client actually know what's in their application? And then 2, is the information truthful? So if the client is just saying, oh, it was only my attorney or some other person, and they don't seem to be as familiar, then the officer will probably pause and try to ask some additional questions just to make sure that this is their story, that these are their facts, this is their claim, because otherwise it may lead into some issues with possible frivolous claims. And so the officer, when they get into the questions, they are going to ask some questions from the form I-589 that includes background information, making sure that their address is still updated, making sure that they know all the employment information. I mean, pretty much that entire application, especially those first 4 pages of that background information, they're going to ask. Just prepare your client to answer the questions. Yes, you already provided the information. Yes, the officer is sitting with the form in their hands while they're talking to you, but the client still needs to ask these questions or answer these questions. And it's mainly due to any potential credibility issues. The officer wants to make sure this is their story, that this is the person sitting in front of them, and that they're the ones that not only are seeking asylum, but deserve to be granted asylum in the United States. The officer is also going to ask some questions about why your client is afraid to return to Afghanistan. So they'll start to get into the latter half of the form, and then also just looking at their declaration. They're just going to ask, why is it that you're afraid to return? So these questions may consist of who are you afraid of? Who do you believe will hurt you? Also, have you ever experienced any type of harm or threats in the past, or did your family or friends? If so, what happened? And the officer is looking for details, looking for specificity when it comes to these answers, just because, again, this is their asylum claim. And then also the officer is going to ask questions about things that could bar your client from asylum. Now, I'm sure that there may be some questions about exactly what these bars look like, and or just understanding how they apply to your client's case. By the time you get to that asylum interview, you should already have that worked out, whether or not there are any applicable bars to your client's case and whether or not they're able to overcome those bars. But they're trying to see if they've had any type of interaction with terrorist activities or have any type of criminal issue. So they may ask questions about, have you ever helped the Taliban in any way or any other terrorist organization? Have you ever committed any crimes of any sense? Make sure that your client knows that these questions are asked of every single asylum applicant, regardless of country. This is just standard. The asylum officers are doing their job. And so they just need to make sure that they are legally able to grant your client their asylum case if they feel that they do have a strong enough case. And so also, just as the attorney, to help you prepare, so if you are starting to hear these questions related to like the Taliban terrorist activities, and obviously if they're not connected to your client's asylum case, it's just indication that you're coming close to the end of the interview, because that's usually the way that the interviews happen, is that they close out the interviews with those questions. So there also will be questions asked of the derivatives. If your client is bringing a spouse or a child, we did say it's important that they show up to the interview. Now, please know that they will not be in the room with the asylum officer and the principal applicant during the majority of the interview. What will happen is either at the beginning or at the end of the interview, the officer will bring in the spouse and the children, and they will ask them just a limited amount of questions. And those questions are mainly about their identifying information, their names, dates of birth, things of that nature, as well as the asylum bar questions. So examples of like, have you ever offered any money to a terrorist organization? Those questions are going to be asked of the spouse and of the children. And please know, we always think it's important for everyone to know, children who are even young will also be asked these asylum questions. That is just the process and procedure of USCIS currently. So children, I've been in interviews where children as young as 4 or 5 years old are asked these questions. Obviously, there's some question as to whether or not they actually fully understand what is being asked of them, but they were asked them. And so it's just good for you as the attorney to prepare with your client ahead of time on how best to approach these types of questions with their children, because we do know these are very extraordinary type of questions and topics to discuss with, especially with young children. And so it's just good for everyone to be on the same page to fully understand and know going into the interview that they are going to be asked these questions. They need to actually respond and answer one way or the other for them to be included on the application, because again, even though they are not the principal applicant, every single person attending that interview is an applicant, that they have to make sure that they all are eligible for asylum. And then also, it's a good note here just to emphasize, and I know Jenny just spoke a lot about the interpreters, but if your principal applicant is fluent in English, but if their spouse or their children are not, which may be common with many of your cases, that spouse and or those children, they are going to need their own interpreter. Your principal applicant cannot interpret for them. So just make sure you're making note of that when you're preparing to go to these interviews. If any of the family members are not as fluent in English, it's okay, but they will not be allowed to interpret for one another because they are all applicants on the same application. All right, now, we encourage clients, or encourage you to instruct your client on how to answer some of these questions. So first, it is important for you as the attorney to tell the client to make sure that they understand that if they don't know something, to tell the officer that they don't know the answer to that question. If they don't remember something, say that to the officer. It's okay to say that they don't remember. If they're not sure of an answer, they can say that they're not sure. They don't understand the interpreter, tell the officer. It's important for them to tell the truth. It's important for them to understand fully what they are being asked and what they are responding to. Because if they do not, then they will possibly answer questions that they don't fully have answers to or full knowledge of, and it may lead to other possible issues or concerns. Now, it is important for them to fully listen to the questions that are being asked. If they are starting to just answer a lot of questions that haven't been asked. And if you're noticing that they're doing that even while they're preparing for the interview, make sure you pause your client to explain, it's important that you just focus on this one particular issue or question, and the officer is always going to ask more questions. All right. Now I'm just going to let Jenny continue to discuss exactly how best to instruct your client with responding to some of these questions.
So the role of the attorney during the interview. What is your role as the representative when you're there at the asylum interview? So it's a pretty limited role. So it's very different from representing someone in immigration court proceedings, which is more like a trial where you have a very active role as the attorney or representative. Your role during the asylum interview is, a lot of your work is really done preparing your client beforehand, and Chelsea was talking about that. During the interview itself, you're pretty limited in what you do. You're there, and actually just honestly being there and being a moral support to your client is really, really helpful and important. It's also a really good idea to take notes. And Chelsea mentioned earlier, you can bring a notebook to take notes, but if it's possible, it's a great idea to bring your laptop or a tablet so that you can, type and take careful notes. You just have to sign a form saying that you're not going to be recording what's going on during the interview from your laptop, but you're allowed to bring it in. You can take notes, and it's a good idea to do that. The asylum interview is going to be asylum officer is going to be taking notes too during the interview, so it can be really useful to have your own kind of verbatim notes about what happened. Something else that you can do during the interview is oftentimes if you can sense that there's some kind of misunderstanding going on between the officer and your client, many officers will let you jump in and help out. You might also, again, depending on the officer might let you jump in to point something important out in the record that the officer didn't seem to have noticed. Another really important thing, and hopefully, in most cases, this doesn't come up, but the asylum interview is supposed to be a non-adversarial interview. And so it's not supposed to be a cross-examination. It's not supposed to be hostile. The questions are supposed to be relevant and asked in a neutral way. If things seem to be going really, really poorly and it starts to feel really hostile, it's important to speak up as the representative. And if necessary, you can actually ask to speak to the officer's supervisor. And if you feel like the officer is doing something really inappropriate during the interview, it's actually best to ask for a supervisor right then and there. And they have supervisory asylum officers at the asylum office, and you can absolutely do that. I have never had to do that, but it's absolutely possible and important if that does come up. Also, at the end of the interview, most officers will let you do one or two things at the end of the interview. They'll often let you ask one or two kind of final questions. And so it's helpful if you think there's something important to stress or that the officer didn't get to, or that you just want to make sure the officer understands, you can ask your client one or two questions at the end. And many officers will also let you make a short closing statement. And it's really good to do that and to take that opportunity. Some people like to prepare those in advance and have kind of a sketch of it in advance. And you can also, though, kind of add to it depending on what actually came up during the interview. And if there was something in particular that seemed to be a sticking point or an issue for the officer, you can talk about that during your brief closing. I have heard, though, in some of these cases recently that officers have been asking attorneys and representatives to submit their closing in writing after the interview. So if they ask that, that's what you're going to do. That's really, again, the role of the representative during the interview. But again, just for the applicant, knowing that you're there with them can be a tremendous moral support to the applicant. And now I'm going to turn things back to Chelsea.
Okay, so we are just going to provide a short clip from a mock interview that we provide in our course, Vicina's Teachable course. Just a few minutes of it as far as to give you an understanding of what this asylum interview is going to look like. And then we will discuss after that how to best prepare your client for their interview as far as the questions.
Okay, Chelsea is working on the audio. So sorry for that, everyone. And I also want to mention that the entire mock interview that we were going to show you a clip from is available in our online course on affirmative asylum for Afghan nationals. And we will provide a link to that at the end of the training today. So you can go and actually, it's free. It just takes a minute to enroll in the course. So you all will have access to watch the full mock asylum interview if we're not able to watch the little clip from it today. So in terms of preparing your client for the asylum interview, some really important things to do are reviewing your client's asylum application with them in advance. So it's really crucial to go over the entire application with the client in advance of the interview. Also review their declaration and make sure that they're totally familiar with what's in the application and the declaration. The asylum officer will absolutely be asking the applicant who prepared this application and declaration, are you aware of everything in here? Is everything in here true and correct? That's going to happen in 100% of interviews. So it's really important that the applicant be fully aware of what's in there. It's also the asylum officer is going to be assessing the person's credibility, in part comparing what they've written in their application and declaration and what they say in the interview. So you want to, and you're preparing the person, be aware if there are any discrepancies with what they're saying now with what's in their declaration, be ready to explain that to the asylum officer and have an explanation for that. In terms of the asylum interview and the I-589 application, asylum officers will kind of often go through the application form in a very painstaking way during the interview to confirm that all the information in it is correct. It is very, very common that when you're preparing someone for the interview, you realize there's a few things in the form that are not correct. Maybe the person moved, maybe they got the name of their grade school wrong, maybe they realized there was a slightly different date for when they lived at one of their addresses, whatever it is. It's really helpful to the officer if you make a list of those and actually provide that to them in writing. They really like that. It makes their job easier. So that's always a good way to get things off on a good foot with the asylum officer, to give them a written list, and they will not be fazed by that. It's not a problem. It happens all the time that there's small things like that that need to be corrected in the form. It's also important to talk to your client about the declaration itself. And again, going over the declaration and making sure that the client feels that they are really fully aware of what's in their own declaration. You do not have to give your client a written copy in their own language. It's great if that's possible. You don't need to, but just make sure that it's been read to them more than once in their own language so that they're really fully aware of it. And again, if you have any updates or changes to make to the declaration, you can also do that in writing at the same time. You also want to look over all the documents that were submitted in the case and make sure that the applicant is aware of all the documents, except for the country conditions. Your client is not responsible for having gathered those or knowing what's in them, so they don't need to worry, and you don't need to worry about translating all those and having them become familiar with the country conditions reports. But any documents that are personal to your client, they should be aware of what those are. And the officer will ask them as well, are you familiar with all the documents that were submitted in your case? Are those things true? Are they real documents? Is there any chance they're fraudulent documents? So your client should definitely be aware of what those documents are. Also, you may have found more documents between the time of submitting the application and going to the interview, and you can absolutely bring things along at the last minute to the interview. But with that said, if you are representing someone, you definitely want to make sure that they understand they should show it to their representative before they get to the asylum office, and don't pull it out and surprise your representative. I had that happen recently with a client where he's pulled something out. Oh, officer, I have this other document. And I thought, and it turned out to not be a problem at all, but it's important to tell clients, yes, you can bring extra things that we didn't already submit, but please show it to me, your representative, before you pull it out at the asylum office. Also, it's a good idea preparing your client for the interview to just discuss the logistics of when and where you're going to meet to go up to the interview, because that really helps minimize the anxiety for your client about this big day in their life, that they know exactly where they're going to find you. And so I think we're ready for the next slide, Chelsea. And Chelsea, did you want to take over, or do you want me to keep going here?
I can chat a bit.
Excellent.
Thank you. So with the preparation, we do encourage you to conduct a mock interview, if not several mock interviews, for your client ahead of time. And so what these interviews entail is asking questions that are expected at the interview, obviously. But what specifically that looks like, and I know even when I have prepared clients in the past, is sitting with the I-589 and actually going through with, a red pen or whatever utensil of your choice, and actually noting while the applicant is answering questions, noting if there's any updates, any questionable information or answers that they're providing. And it just gives the client an understanding that this is what's actually going to happen. The officer will sit there with their I-589 and go through and ask, starting with the name and the address and their date of birth and their place of birth, just going through all of that information just to give them an understanding as far as how it's going to feel. It very much is going to feel like an interview. Obviously, the officer won't know them the way that you do. Also, this gives the client an opportunity to ease some anxiety that they may have going into this interview. So I'm sure that many of your clients, and maybe some of you as attorneys, are going to be somewhat anxious trying to figure out what to expect at this interview, how it's going to go. And so we've realized that over time, obviously, the more practice that you have with your client, the more at ease they seem to be about it, and able to share more for their story and be more prepared. Now, with this interview, we suggest that you provide an interpreter for your client if they at all intend to use an interpreter for the interview. Even if your client is somewhat fluent in English, but they say during the interview they want to have an interpreter, then you should do these interviews, or at least one of the interviews, with an interpreter if possible. Because again, it gives them the idea of how to work with an interpreter, how to slow down, how to pause, how to interact with the interpreter best, so that they have already had experience by the time they walk into the asylum interview, and therefore there's no additional unnecessary delays. And then also with this interview, we do believe it's important that you focus only on the principal applicant's testimony. As we previously shared, the principal applicant is going to be the only one providing testimony regarding the asylum claim itself. If you've had, while preparing for this interview, if you've had a lot of your clients having family members chiming in, whether it's because of a language issue or barrier, or even if it's because of some interactions and as far as the gender roles, if your principal applicant is a female, and maybe her husband has been the one sharing more of the information, this is the time that she needs to step up and share her story. With all due respect to the culture, and we understand that why that is in place, and they're used to that type of practice, but the husband is not going to be allowed in the room, either as a son or an uncle or a cousin. It's going to be that main applicant, and so the applicant needs to be more comfortable with telling their own story in their own words, because it will only be you and the asylum officer with them in the interview room for most of the time. Now, Jenny just is going to provide some information about what happens after the interview.
So after the interview, the asylum office is supposed to make a decision. And Congress has said that for these Afghan asylum interviews, USCIS is supposed to issue a final decision within 150 days from the date the I-589 is submitted. That was a law that Congress passed right around the time of the evacuation in September of 2021. They haven't been adhering to that very well, and which is different actually from a lot of affirmative asylum applications where the applicant will get their decision within a few weeks after the interview. USCIS is sitting on lots of these cases for longer than 150 days from the time the I-589 is submitted. And there's somewhat limited recourse there. You can follow up with emails to the asylum office to remind them that the case is pending. You can contact your congressional representative. They all have immigration liaisons who can reach out and ask as well. Beyond that, they're looking at filing what's called a mandamus lawsuit, possibly in federal court, to compel them, but that's obviously a much bigger lift and more difficult than simply doing affirmative asylum applications. So it's important to set your client's expectations in these cases that they may be waiting for months to get a decision on their case at this point, unfortunately. And what are the different possibilities when USCIS does make a decision? So at this point, there are three possibilities. The first is the best one, is what you want, that asylum was granted, which means that the principal and the derivatives are now asylees, and can stay in the US more or less indefinitely. They can apply for a green card after a year with asylum. They are work authorized just by virtue of having asylum. Someone whose spouse and children are not in the United States can now file a Form I-730 to start the process to bring their spouse and minor children here to the United States. So that's what you're hoping for, asylum granted. But if USCIS feels that they can't grant asylum, at this point, for an Afghan evacuee, USCIS would issue something called a notice of intent to deny. And that's what they issue when someone is in a lawful status and they intend to deny the case. If someone's out of status, they would get what's called referred to the immigration court. But the Afghan evacuees all still are in parole status until, starting in August this year is when the first folks ended up here in the United States. And so if somebody is in a lawful status when USCIS wants to deny the case, the affirmative asylum case, again, they issue something called a notice of intent to deny, which says, dear asylum applicant, we're planning to deny your case and here's why. And you actually get a chance to rebut that. So if your client receives a notice of intent to deny, you're going to absolutely want to respond. And you're given a certain amount of time on the notice of intent to deny to respond. There's actually, because of COVID, the agency has given people longer timelines, like an extra 60 days, and that's still in place. So there'll be a period of time where you can respond in writing to this notice of intent to deny, and you can submit additional evidence in the case. You can submit argument about why USCIS is wrong and your client actually does qualify for asylum. But after that, if they're still not, so they could decide, and sometimes they do, sometimes they're convinced by somebody's response to a notice of intent to deny, and they will approve the case. But if they decide they're still convinced that the applicant is not eligible for asylum, they'll issue a denial. What is that? What happens if your client receives a denial? So a few important points. This does not mean they're automatically being deported. That's absolutely not what's going to happen. Your client would still be in valid parole status. That wouldn't change. And so eventually their parole will expire and they'll be out of status. But even then, before someone can be deported from the United States, they have to go through removal proceedings in immigration court, and an immigration judge has to order that person removed. So not only is there no automatic deportation if you receive a denial on your asylum, you'd have to, again, be put into removal proceedings, and it's not clear, we don't know to what extent that's going to happen when Afghan parolees fall out of status when their parole expires. We don't know. Will USCIS and ICE be immediately putting people in removal proceedings or not? We don't know. But in removal proceedings in front of an immigration judge, you get another chance, another bite at the apple, and you get to apply kind of all over again from the beginning for asylum. And there's also some other forms of humanitarian protection that are available in immigration court proceedings, but not at the asylum office. Something called withholding of removal, and also importantly, something called protection under the Convention Against Torture. There's like a little box on the asylum application to check if your client wants torture convention relief. You always want to check that at the affirmative stage, but the asylum office can't grant that. It's something that can only be granted by an immigration judge. And this may be an important form of protection for some of Afghan evacuees who may end up facing various bars to asylum, including a persecutor bar or the terrorism-related inadmissibility grounds because of their involvement in various military activities in Afghanistan. But they might, in the end, if put into removal proceedings, be eligible for protection under the Convention Against Torture because there's a good chance that they would be tortured by the Taliban if they had to go back to Afghanistan. So all of that to say, again, if your client receives a denial that does not result automatically in deportation by any means at all, there's a whole immigration court process with several layers of appeals possible after the immigration court level. It's good at that point, though, if your client does receive a denial, to talk with your client about what it means and discuss whether or not you'd be able to represent them if they're actually put into removal proceedings eventually. And with that, I think we're at the end of our slides, Chelsea, and we are able to take some more questions.
Yeah, we just wanted to, yeah, there's a couple of questions and I have a couple queued up for you, Jenny, but we just wanted to make sure that we note that we have provided a lot of different free resources to attorneys and accredited representatives to help with these Afghan affirmative asylum cases. So as we did mention, we do have a complete teachable course that provides pretty much any and everything you need to know about how to help your client's asylum case from start to finish. It does provide a mock asylum interview video, the one that we are trying to provide today. There's just some technical issues, so we're not able to do that. But that also in that same course, there are some sets of asylum interview questions for more recent Afghan interviews that we provide. So you can click in there and see what other videos or templates or whatever may be helpful to you. And please feel free to use that resource to help your clients. Also similar to this particular session, if you do need for your clients, for them to have an understanding of what to expect at the interview, we have done similar sessions as this LOP in English, Dari, and Pashto specifically for Afghan applicants. And so those are available on our site. So please look into that link and look at that information. And then also we have recently provided a new teachable course specifically on asylum interview prep. So it's a much more condensed, focused course that helps attorneys and non-attorneys alike help prepare Afghan applicants as far as what a mock interview would look like. So that is brand new just in the last week or two. So we encourage you to look into that resource as well. And I will just leave that page up for a little bit. But Jenny, I know there's a couple of questions about whether or not an interpreter is still useful if the applicant does speak some English.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really depends on your client's comfort with speaking English and their fluency level. If your client is fully fluent in English and you have always communicated with your client 100% in English and they read and speak it well, there may not be a need and it's going to be kind of getting in the way to have an interpreter. But if your client doesn't feel completely comfortable in English and their English isn't totally fluent, and remember that the asylum interview is a stressful situation, then it may be a really good idea to have an interpreter available, and you're going to want to make sure to practice that. One thing I will say, for applicants who speak some English, it's really important to practice with them that they wait for the interpreter before they start answering questions, because what can happen is if somebody understands some English, they may want to jump in and start answering the question. And if the applicant keeps speaking English, the officer is going to say, hey, we don't need the interpreter. We're just going to go forward in English. So if you do have a client who speaks some English, important to practice that. And it's, it's a decision between your client and you as to at what point you absolutely need to have an interpreter there.
Thank you for that. And then one other question we have is asking about the process for interviewing children. They just want to know, what does that look like? Are children interviewed alone? Or can they be in groups?
Yep, that's a great question. So what will happen is if there are children derivatives on the case, ideally the asylum officer can get to them first and not make the children wait around, but they'll be brought in with the principal applicant all together at once and be questioned together. And in fact, in our course on Afghan asylum cases, we have some sets of interview questions, verbatim interview questions from some recent Afghan asylum interviews with all the identifying details taken out. But there's one in there that includes some child derivatives. So you can see kind of what happened there. And that was actually from my own client's case. She had several children. They were ages like 5 through 12. They were all there in the office together. The officer does ask them bars to asylum questions about whether they ever committed crimes or aided terrorists. Why the US government feels the need to do that with young children is beyond me, but they do it. And the children will probably almost always be there in the room together. And you can take a look at that list of questions to see how it happened and like what kind of questions the officer asked.
Okay, and then one other question I know we didn't necessarily address, remote appearances by attorneys at interviews, but attorneys just asking if we have any tips as far as if they are appearing remotely, just helping with the client in the interview if they are in person.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I haven't done that, so I'm not sure that I have necessarily any tips on that. Chelsea, do you?
I would just say I haven't done an asylum interview, but I have done other types of interviews with USCIS. So first, obviously, just make sure at all times you're able to hear the officer clearly, and either the client or the interpretation clearly. Obviously, the officer will, well, I should say, obviously, ideally, the officer will ask and clarify to make sure that everyone can hear everyone okay, but definitely make sure that's the case, because if you're taking notes, you obviously need to hear since you won't be there to witness what's happening. Also, I would just say, as far as with your client and like the setup, just make sure that you're able to check in with your client a little bit ahead of time. So if you all have like a call time, 15 minutes before the interview begins, just touch base on the phone or something like that. One is just to help settle the client and their nerves, but then also making sure that they are there, that they are in the correct place, and then they are ready and set to attend the interview. But I would not necessarily see there's really any difference as far as if you feel like there are some say questionable actions by the officer, or you think that something does need to be clarified, still feel free to do that on the phone, obviously respectfully.
And I think we have a helpful suggestion about remote interviews here, saying for remote interviews, first ask how to log on and get on again if you're dropped. That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Right. So I know we've gone a little bit over time, so we appreciate your patience. And I think that is going to be the end of this session today. This was the first one of this format, and we do think it was successful, so we appreciate your attendance. Again, this recording is going to be provided. It's actually going to be provided at the same link that the other LOPs have been provided. So vicina.org/Afghan interview prep. So if you do want to share this with any of your colleagues or any of your pro bono teams, if you are working with pro bonos, please feel free to do that. We think we may host this session again, so please be on the lookout for that. But we do really wish you all the best with your clients' cases. And yeah, we look forward to providing more resources for you in the future.